class. This is Philosophy 356, Christian Philosophy. I hope you've enjoyed the first week of readings that you've had. I'm doing this first video to kind of lay some of the framework of how this class is functioning and then kind of dive in a little bit into next week's readings. The first few things I want to say about Christian philosophy is this term for Christian philosophy is kind of a modern, more recent term, which combines the Christian faith, which, Christianity, of course, is a lived religious tradition, and with that comes all kinds of practices and beliefs and attitudes and actions. It's a cultural phenomenon, of course, as Christianity is embodied in people's lives. It expresses itself culturally, it expresses itself through artistic forms, through patterns of life, through political structures, and all of these various forms. So when we talk about Christianity, it's this extremely broad, comprehensive phenomenon. But of course, in Christian philosophy, philosophers are primarily concerned with examining ideas, beliefs, assertions, and arguments. Philosophy is primarily about rigorously examining various claims to see in what way those claims can be considered legitimate or not. And so when philosophers tend to treat Christianity, they tend to take this giant historical phenomenon, cultural, religious, spiritual, artistic, political phenomenon, right? And they tend to kind of abstract from that basic beliefs or ideas and try to interrogate those as being what to consider in what way they can be they're false or in some way can be verified or justifiable in some way. And so they're primarily concerned with Christian beliefs more than those other phenomena. That's part of the reason why at the beginning of this course I asked you to write an essay, Are Christian Beliefs Credible? Christianity is much more than a set of beliefs, but as philosophers we're engaged in examining various claims, various beliefs to see if they're credible. And that first essay that I asked you to write, it's just a personal reflection paper. It's just sort of kind of get you thinking about, what do I think about Christian beliefs if I examine them? And I just asked you to pick basically one or two that you would like to examine. There's so many, of course, that you could really kind of dive into, but that's what that's about. It's kind of a first step in philosophy. It's trying to examine various beliefs or claims and using various tools at your disposal to see in what way those claims might be considered valid or not. So that's what this is about. As a first step, and that's kind of what we'll be doing throughout this class, is kind of examining some of these claims. And that's one of the reasons why I'm asking you all to begin with this philosophy of religion book. Is strictly speaking, I mean, this is considered philosophy of religion, which is more comprehensive than Christian philosophy. But I think this is a good introduction because Evans kind of works through how we can examine some of these claims, and he's kind of showing you in some ways how philosophy works and in what way philosophy can be an aid to examining, understanding claims of the Christian faith, and with that other faiths as well. So you're kind of getting your feet wet in understanding how philosophy can work in relationship or in dialogue with Christian faith and Christian beliefs. This is a different way of going than I could have gone, where I could have pulled out various Christian thinkers. But I do think this is probably a good way to go. One thing I will say about this book is it doesn't really focus much on specific Christian beliefs like the incarnation of Christ, or the crucifixion, or the resurrection, or the sacraments, or anything that's really distinctly sort of revealed in the Christian story, the story surrounding Jesus, and um, uh, uh, all the other stories as they relate to Jesus. Um, this is more kind of a broader, more general understanding, but it does, I hope you'll see, relate. So, for example, when we talk about religious experience, how does religious experience relate to one's experience of Jesus? You can see how the two will kind of overlap. Or miracles. I mean, the incarnation, the resurrection, these things are all sort of bound together. It's this one central, the Christian story is this one central miracle that God entered history and brought nature up with the resurrected Jesus. And all the sort of little miracles that you see in the Gospels all sort of point to this one central miracle. So the Christian story really rests on a claim that the miraculous is at the core. And so if you were to come to the conclusion that miracles are impossible, that would pretty much invalidate the Christian story. I mean, out of all of the sort of religious traditions major religious traditions that are out there, for example, C.S. Lewis made this point, Christianity is probably the most dependent on a belief in miracles, because the great story is itself a story of a miracle. And so in that way, the discussions about miracles, etc., are going to relate specifically to the central claims of the Christian story, which is, of course, that God became flesh and gave himself for humanity, and in his death and in his resurrection, he has, some sense, redeemed or brought human nature, and with it all nature, into the life of God in a saving way. And so that central core message of Christianity, the gospel, is in a very direct way related to some of these maybe more abstract questions about are miracles possible, and what way we might consider claims to miraculous events as being valid. So I hope you can see how those would be directly related. So we're going to touch on this. This is indirectly related specifically to Christian claims, but also more comprehensively to the Christian story as a whole, the claims in this book. And then from here we're going to move to this book by Thomas Aquinas. Not by Thomas Aquinas, by Brian Davies, on Thomas Aquinas' account of God and evil. And this is sort of diving in more specifically to a major Christian thinker and working through some of their philosophical concepts and ideas to understand one issue that is pressing to pretty much everyone today, which is, why is there so much evil in the world? And if there is so much evil in the world, does that give grounds or evidence to say God doesn't exist, or that claims that God created this world and that God loves this world really aren't valid, because look at all this evil that we find around. Those would seem to just contradict the idea that there is a God, or at least a God that is good and loves us and has created us. This is going to be something we explore in the second half of the course. And it's a good book. It's a good presentation of basic philosophical concepts of Thomas Aquinas, but also addresses this important question about God and evil. I want to spend just a minute introing the next three chapters. You read the first three chapters this week, chapters 1, 2, and 3. And this next week we have chapters 4, 5, and 6. Now, chapter 4 is on religious experience, and I'm going to attach a link to another online lecture I did on religious experience, so I don't have to rehash that. The second one is talking about miracles and whether claims to miraculous events are in any way rationally or intellectually can be validated or have any grounds philosophically. And then the final chapter is on religion and science. So I kind of want, I've done, like I said, these other lectures on experience and miracles. And so I want to talk a little bit about religion, modernity, and science. And I also want to tie it a little bit to your chapter you read this week on the existence of God, just to kind of bring up a couple of points that I think is important for people to see. Basically, just kind of laying out what I see as some basic errors that I hope you guys can avoid, so you can kind of get a little bit clearer on how to treat the question of God and science. The first one is something that Evans kind of talks about is science. We use this word science, and oftentimes it's capitalized with a big S, as if science makes claims. There's this thing called science, and it makes claims about the world. And that itself is kind of it's misleading, because in truth there's no such thing as science. There are various disciplines that try to interrogate our world, try to examine our world in various ways. And if you actually look at those various disciplines, they're not really connected by any single core. There are disciplines within the scientific, there are traditions of scientific examination that are almost purely theoretical, mathematical, that have little to no empirical basis. If we're going to be talking about theoretical physics, for example, it's almost purely mathematical. They might be able to touch in some way on empirical experience. When I mean empirical experience, I mean something that we can actually test by putting it in a test tube, something you can see, touch, taste, or smell. It does have some tie to that, but a very thin tie. And then you take something like paleontology, which is almost entirely historical. There's no mathematics to it. There's no way to predict. It's not about having a hypothesis and then predicting an outcome. And if that outcome comes true, then then we can validate that hypothesis, because it's primarily a historical discipline. And then just to show you two sort of extremes, one is almost purely historical, one's almost purely mathematical, but they're both called scientific disciplines. You try to find some single method, some single core that ties all these together, and you can't find it. And there's not a single voice in science. Of course, we all know that these traditions are sort of developing, and there's internal debates among various scientists about these things, and that's in part what makes the discipline move forward. And so when people typically says science says this, they're saying the reigning scientific opinion is such, okay, or the majority scientific opinion, or the long established tradition is such. And I think that's important for us to recognize, because we can dub capital S science with a certain kind of unquestionable authority, which it doesn't have, and on the very grounds of what scientists claim they're trying to do, ought not to have, because science is, scientists are supposed to be open-ended and willing to allow their own ideas to be examined and questioned. So the first thing, I want us to think about science as historical, something that's developmental, rather than a single view of the world that is comprehensive and unquestionable. That would be a misleading, I think, assumption about these things. So when we talk about science and God, for example, what we have to ask ourselves is, what are we talking about when we're talking about science? And what I'm trying to say is we're talking about a variety of traditions of examination, okay? A variety of traditions of examination. And what those traditions could or could not have to say about the question about God. And right now I'm going to talk about God's existence. So people say, can science prove God exists, or science prove that God doesn't exist? I want you to kind of see some problems with this kind of question, the way that it's set up. You know, the first thing I think, the assumption that we might have is, again, we're not talking about science says God exists or science doesn't say God exists. We have scientists in various forms of exploration. Now, when it goes to questions about God, we tend to move toward something like physics, where we say, do physicists who trying to examine and understand the underlying physical structure of our universe, understand the causes and effects of physical phenomena, do those specialists who investigate that, what bearing does that have on the question of God and God's existence? I want you to see something about this. We have to kind of look at this a little bit more carefully, because God, if we take the classic understanding of God as non-physical, non-material, eternal, infinite, then you have to begin to ask yourself, well, in what sense could scientists say something about the existence of or non-existence of God? Because if scientists are primarily concerned with understanding the natural world and physical phenomena, and people of the Christian tradition and virtually every tradition says that, well, God isn't that, then in what sense can scientists say something about the existence or non-existence of God? So I guess I hope you see that it's going to be difficult for us to sort of bring these two at least easily together. One of the ways that we can do that and try to investigate that is through the cosmological argument. And as you read in Evans this last week, cosmological argument is primarily an argument that says we can demonstrate rationally that God exists. It's reasonable to assert that God exists because we can interrogate the structure of our world. We can interrogate how things work in our world. And to explain that requires this. Okay? So that's the way that the cosmological argument basically works. It says, if everything, for example, that we experience in the world commonsensically has a cause, if my coffee cup here gets colder, it gets colder because something has happened to it. Something's caused it to go colder. The explanation for my coffee getting cold is explained by some cause, the temperature of the room having an effect on the temperature of the coffee. And so the effect of the coffee growing colder is produced by a certain cause. And the question here, of course, is if we trace these causes back, from one explanation, the coffee growing colder, to the temperature of the room, and we ask, well, where does the temperature of the room, how does that get where it gets? Well, it has other causes that produce that effect, which is the temperature of the room. Now, that itself is produced by other causes, right? And so the question is again, can we have an infinite regress of causes? That means this phenomenon is explained by this one, which is explained by this one, which is explained by this one. We trace this all the way back logically, right? There has to be a beginning, or can this series go on forever? Okay. Now we're getting into the question, one of the ways of framing the question in the cosmological argument. Does logic lead us to the conclusion there has to be some origin? There has to be some first cause. Okay? Or can we just have an infinite regress of causes? Okay? That would be one issue in the cosmological argument. But I want you to see here one thing. We have now moved from scientific explanation, that is, a specific reason for this physical phenomenon, my coffee growing colder, okay, to a logical problem or logical issue, okay, which is, can you have an infinite regress of causes, or do causes require a first cause? Okay. Now we've moved into philosophy. we've moved into the question of logic, and we moved into, we moved into the field of logic, and we moved into the field of metaphysics, okay? So we moved from physics, okay, physical phenomena, to metaphysics, which is the logical structure or basis or framework required to explain this physical phenomenon. And so the reason why I'm bringing that up is because oftentimes when we try to treat the question of God exists and we want to ask, well, what does science say about the existence of God? We want to lean on science because we produce all kinds of great things from science. Scientific exploration, scientific understanding, scientific examination has proved itself extremely successful in explaining physical phenomena in our world, and we build all kinds of cool gadgets because of science, my phone, and so we want to trust it. We want to trust it to try to answer this question. But typically what happens when we do that is we turn to scientists who are trained in explaining physical phenomena, and then we ask them, well, what would you have to say about this other thing, God? But at this point, when we move from something that we can see, taste, touch, and smell, or perhaps some other discipline, historical discipline or mathematical discipline within science, scientific exploration, right? And we start asking them, we're asking them to start to work as a philosopher, because now we're asking them about metaphysics and we're asking them about logic. And I want to encourage you to always question whether, question the logic behind some of the arguments that are made. So, for example, even some very preeminent scientists today are kind of known for making some pretty unfortunate logical errors when speaking about God. Even someone as great as Stephen Hawking, as far as a theoretical physicist, explaining the basic structure of our world, says if you understand the structure of our universe, he made this claim a couple years ago, we can see that there's no need for God. Now, the question there is, when we actually begin to look at his claims, we see that these claims are metaphysical claims, okay? And often they're even by somebody, as brilliant as him in terms of theoretical physics, doesn't quite understand the nature of the question. Because, for example, what philosophers, theologians within, for example, Christian philosophy have said about God is that creation by God is not something that occurs essentially at any specific point in time. So God is timeless. God is outside, we might say outside of time. In other words, God is not a part of the causal sequence of the universe. Okay, God is not one causal agent among others inside our universe. Okay, God is not a thing in the universe. God's not a big being out in the galaxy having some effect on other things in the universe. God's not an item within the universe. There's lots of ways of being able to talk about this. So God's not judged as being a cause in the causal sequence of the universe. Okay, because the universe, as Christians and Muslims and Jews and many other faith traditions assert, God is the cause for the universe itself. Okay, so anything, as they would phrase it, they would say God is the cause of being, created existence. And scientists are trying to find within a sequence or network of material causes, right, what forms that chain of causation. Okay. But what philosophers have been trying to assert, Christian philosophers and others have been trying to assert, is not God is not a sequence within the chain. God is the explanation for the chain itself. Okay, and therefore God is not something that can be examined by scientists as within that causal sequence at all. Okay, so what I'm trying to get you to see here, just by raising this particular issue, is that to understand some of these questions as to the nature of the relationship between God and Christian claims in religion and science. We can't just turn to scientific explanations, scientific methods, scientists themselves to answer these questions unless we expect these questions to fit within this framework. And unfortunately, what happens when we do that is that these claims that Christians and others are making become something else. Stephen Hawking seems to assume that God is a non-material being in the universe, a causal agent among other causal agents, and not really understanding the difference between existing phenomena, okay, and the cause of existence itself. And that's a common mistake that people make when investigating some of these claims. Especially scientists often make this mistake because they're trying the best that they can to investigate this question of God with the tools at their disposal. But the tools at their disposal are really geared toward investigating specific material phenomena, not questions of, for example, logic or metaphysics. There's no way to empirically demonstrate the existence or non-existence of God. And I mean empirically demonstrate, I mean by seeing, tasting, touching, or smelling, if indeed God is not something you can see, taste, touch, or smell by definition. In that way, we need to understand the limitations of various scientific methods, and we need to recognize that also that the questions of God need to be framed in such a way that those claims can be interrogated for what they are, not interrogated for something that they're not. So let me give you one more example. One classic blunder made was one by Richard Dawkins when he said, evolution explains the existence of the universe and does not require God. Well, evolution, by definition, is the process of development, organic development, of existing things. So it explains a process of already existing things, right, in their development to other existing things, right, primarily species, right. It does not even address the question, why is something rather than nothing? Why the existence of the universe rather than nothing at all? That is something that cannot be treated by the methods of evolutionary biology. That's a question of metaphysics. And so I want you to try to see that philosophy is an important discipline because it can kind of mediate the two. Because philosophy is more open-ended, and it's primarily concerned with logic, it's able to investigate in some sense the grounds of scientific method and also the claims of Christian faith, and can kind of mediate between the two. But we have to be skilled as philosophers to be able to do that. We can't just look to scientists to answer that question, or look just to people of faith to say, yeah, this is the way it is. So I hope that helps you a bit. I'm not gonna keep talking because this is moving on to be about a half an hour discussion. So I hope this is a good introduction discussion. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me, and I will speak to you soon.